In 1876, the riders of Broxton County committed a mistake so enormous it would erase their entire chapter of terror. At dusk on a Thursday evening, nearly 500 members of the Klan closed a tightening ring around a lone black man riding home from the schoolhouse he taught in. They believed he was cornered, a teacher with no allies, no weapons, and nowhere to run. By their own accounts, the circle held firm for less than 60 seconds before the first horses fell, before the first rifles vanished from riders' hands, before men at the very center swore they heard shots without seeing a shooter. By sunrise, their leaders were missing, half their ranks refused to speak again, and the surviving riders abandoned their robes in the river. So who was that man they thought they surrounded? And what did he do in that circle that turned an army into ghosts? Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The afternoon sun hung low over Dunbar Hollow when Elias Cross dismissed his students for the day. Dust motes floated through the single-room schoolhouse as small hands gathered slates and primers. He stood by the door, watching them file out one by one, children whose futures he fought to shape, with lessons in reading, arithmetic, and quiet dignity. "Good night, Mr. Cross," they called, their voices bright against the Mississippi heat. "Mind your studies," he replied, his tone gentle but firm. "Tomorrow we continue Caesar's campaigns." The last child disappeared down the dirt path toward town. Elias closed the door and locked it with a heavy iron key. He moved through the empty classroom, straightening benches and collecting forgotten pencils. His movements were methodical, unhurried. The schoolhouse smelled of chalk dust and pine resin. Outside, his horse waited beneath a sprawling oak. The gelding was unremarkable. Brown coat, white blaze, the kind of animal that drew no attention. Elias stroked its neck before mounting, settling into the worn saddle with practiced ease. His saddlebags contained nothing but lesson plans and a few borrowed books he intended to return. He turned the horse toward home. The road stretched ahead through clusters of longleaf pine. Shadows lengthened across the red clay earth as the sun dipped lower. Elias rode at an easy pace, his posture relaxed, but his eyes constantly moving. Years of teaching had not dulled certain habits. The pine woods closed in on both sides. Spanish moss hung from twisted branches like tattered curtains. Normally, this stretch hummed with life. Birds calling, insects buzzing, squirrels chattering in the canopy. Elias noticed the silence first. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, nothing. He continued forward without changing pace. His hands rested loosely on the reins. To any observer, he appeared unconcerned, just another tired teacher heading home after a long day. But his breathing had shifted into a deeper, more controlled rhythm. Then he heard it. Distant hoofbeats. Many of them. The sound came from multiple directions, rolling through the trees like approaching thunder. Elias kept riding. He rounded a bend where the road widened slightly, offering better visibility through the pines. Dust clouds rose in the distance, east, west, north. Too many to count. His farm lay another mile ahead, just past the crossroads. He could turn back toward town, but the hoofbeats behind him suggested that path was already blocked. Forward was his only option. The gelding sensed his tension and snorted nervously. Elias patted its shoulder, murmuring words that soothed them both. They reached the crossroads as the sun touched the horizon. The riders appeared like ghosts, materializing from smoke. They came from every direction, their horses kicking up red dust that caught the dying light. White hoods covered their faces, eye holes cut into fabric that flapped in the evening breeze. They wore no uniforms, but their formation was organized, deliberate. They moved with the confidence of men who believed themselves invincible. 500, perhaps more. The circle tightened with mechanical precision. Elias stopped his horse in the center of the crossroads. He sat perfectly still as the ring of riders closed around him, their mounts' hooves beating a steady rhythm against packed earth. The circle contracted until he could see individual details: the frayed hem of a hood, the nervous twitching of a horse's ear, the glint of rifle barrels. His eyes swept the formation. He noted spacing between riders, approximately 8 feet. He checked wind direction, feeling the breeze against his left cheek, steady and predictable. He observed which horses were fresh and which had been ridden hard. He catalogued nervous riders versus confident ones, identifying weak points in their discipline. A man rode forward from the northern quadrant. His hood bore a crimson cross, marking him as the captain. He was broad-shouldered, sitting tall in his saddle with theatrical authority. His horse, a black stallion, pranced and tossed its head. "You're on the wrong road, teacher," the captain called. His voice carried across the circle, amplified by the expectant silence. "We don't tolerate your kind educating children, filling their heads with notions." Elias said nothing. His hands remained steady on the reins. "Get down from that horse," the captain ordered. "We're taking you to answer for your crimes against the natural order." The riders shifted in their saddles, anticipating sport. Some laughed. Others leaned forward, eager to watch humiliation unfold. Elias reached up slowly and removed his wire-rimmed spectacles. He folded them with deliberate care and tucked them into his vest pocket. Without the glasses, his eyes became sharper, more focused. The tired schoolteacher's slouch vanished from his shoulders. He straightened in the saddle. His right hand moved to his hip, brushing aside his coat to reveal a holstered revolver. The weapon was well-maintained but unremarkable, a Colt Army model, standard issue from another life. His left hand remained visible, palm open, fingers relaxed. "I will not be getting down," Elias said quietly. The captain laughed. "You think one old Negro with a pistol can—" Elias drew and fired in a single fluid motion. The bullet struck the captain's shoulder, spinning him sideways in the saddle. He toppled backward with a cry of shock, crashing into the dust. His black stallion bolted immediately, breaking through the circle's eastern quadrant. Chaos erupted. Riders yanked their reins in confusion. Horses reared and screamed. Men shouted contradictory orders. Elias fired again, the shot ricocheting off an iron stirrup to strike the rifle held by a rider to his left. The weapon flew from startled hands. Another shot severed the reins of a horse directly behind him, sending the animal bucking wildly through the formation. He didn't aim to kill. Each bullet served a specific tactical purpose: disarm, disable, scatter. A rider charged from the right, raising a shotgun. Elias shot the reins from his grip. The horse veered sharply, colliding with 2 other mounts and creating a tangle of panicked animals. He fired at the ground near a cluster of horses, sending them stampeding outward. The circle fractured. Riders struggled to control their terrified mounts as the formation dissolved into pandemonium. Elias reloaded without looking down, his fingers finding cartridges by muscle memory. The entire process took seconds. He fired again, targeting another set of reins, then another stirrup, creating cascading disorder. Men who came expecting easy violence now faced something they couldn't comprehend: a single opponent systematically dismantling their overwhelming numerical advantage. The retreat began in scattered clusters. Riders wheeled their horses and fled back toward the tree line, abandoning formation and comrades alike. Within minutes, the crossroads emptied, except for a few riderless horses wandering in confused circles. Elias sat motionless, his revolver still drawn, watching the last white hoods disappear into the gathering dusk. His breathing slowed, controlled, and measured. The dust began to settle around him. He holstered his weapon and retrieved his spectacles, settling them back on his nose. The wounded captain had been dragged away by his men, leaving only bloodstains in the dirt. Elias turned his horse toward home. The pine woods swallowed him as darkness fell, and the identity he had buried years ago emerged fully into the fading light. The farmhouse emerged from the gloom as Elias guided his horse down the narrow path. A simple structure, whitewashed boards, a tin roof, a covered porch that faced east to catch morning light. He had built it himself 8 years ago, hammering every nail, cutting every board. The windows were dark now, reflecting nothing but starlight. He dismounted near the small stable behind the house. The gelding huffed and stamped, still nervous from the encounter at the crossroads. Elias ran his hand along its neck, feeling the dampness of sweat beneath the coat. "Easy," he murmured. "We're home!" He unsaddled the horse methodically, checking for injuries or saddle sores by lantern light. The leather was dusty but intact. He brushed the animal down with careful strokes, working through the familiar routine until both their heartbeats returned to normal. Fresh hay went into the manger, clean water into the trough. Inside the stable, Elias hung the tack on wooden pegs. His movements remained precise, controlled. He retrieved the revolver from his hip holster and examined it by lamplight. The barrel showed residue from 6 fired rounds. He counted the remaining cartridges in his belt. 12. Not enough if they returned. He cleaned the weapon with practiced efficiency, using an oil-soaked cloth kept in a tin box beneath the saddle rack. The familiar smell of gun oil filled the small space. His hands remembered the ritual even after years of deliberately avoiding it. When the revolver gleamed clean, he wrapped it in oilcloth and placed it inside a concealed compartment beneath the floorboard, a hiding spot he had installed but never expected to use again. A second revolver joined the first, along with 2 boxes of ammunition he kept for emergencies that never came. Until tonight. He covered the compartment with scattered hay and extinguished the stable lantern. Darkness settled around him like a familiar coat. The farmhouse felt emptier than usual when he stepped inside. He lit a lamp in the front room, adjusting the wick until soft light pushed back the shadows. Everything stood exactly where he had left it that morning. Books stacked on the side table, a half-finished letter to a publisher in Boston, the rocking chair his wife had loved. Elias washed his hands in the basin, scrubbing away gunpowder residue and the road dust. The water turned gray. He dried his hands on a clean towel and stood for a moment, staring at his reflection in the small mirror above the basin, the same face he saw every morning. Graying hair, lines around his eyes, the quiet dignity of a schoolteacher. But something had shifted in his expression, a hardness that hadn't been there this morning. Hoofbeats approached from the road. Elias moved to the window, staying back from the glass. 3 riders came fast up his path, but these were neighbors. He recognized the horses before he saw their faces. Samuel Porter, the blacksmith, Thomas Reed, who ran the general store, and Mary Graves, whose children sat in the front row of his classroom. They dismounted in a rush, nearly stumbling over each other to reach his porch. Elias opened the door before they could knock. "Mr. Cross!" Samuel's chest heaved from hard riding. "We saw them. The White Hoods, running through town like the devil himself was chasing. What happened?" The 3 crowded into his front room, breathless and wide-eyed. Mary gripped her shawl tight around her shoulders. Thomas kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting riders to materialize from darkness. "Sit," Elias said quietly. "Catch your breath." They settled into chairs, though none of them relaxed. Samuel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Word spreading fast. They're saying one man turned back 500 Klansmen. Saying it was you. Elias stood by the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back. "I defended myself at the crossroads. They left." "Defended yourself?" Thomas's voice cracked. "They're saying you shot the captain off his horse, that you scattered them like corn before wind. How does a school teacher—" "I wasn't always a teacher." The room fell silent. Mary's eyes widened. Samuel sat back in his chair, studying Elias with new understanding. Years ago, Elias continued slowly, I went by another name, the Night Sparrow. I worked against outlaw gangs in Texas and Arkansas, not as a lawman, as something else. A gunslinger, Samuel breathed. A tactician. Elias moved to the window, looking out at the dark road. I studied how gangs operated, their patterns, their weaknesses. I dismantled them by understanding how they thought, where they positioned sentries, how they coordinated raids. I used that knowledge to turn their own strategies against them. He paused, remembering. There was a gang terrorizing homesteaders outside San Antonio. 15 men. They'd attack farms at night, burning crops, stealing livestock. I watched them for 3 weeks, learned their rotation schedules, which routes they preferred, who led, who followed. Then I created situations where they thought they were ambushing me, but I controlled every variable, the terrain, the lighting, the timing. You fought them alone? Mary asked. I outthought them. That's different from fighting. Elias turned back to face his neighbors. I disabled their horses, cut their supply lines, made them paranoid of their own shadows. When they finally fell apart, most scattered rather than face capture. I only killed when absolutely necessary. Thomas stood abruptly. Then you can help us. Teach us what you know. If the clan comes back— No. The word came sharp and final. That life ended when I came here. I wanted peace. I wanted to build something instead of destroying things. But you still have the skills, Samuel pressed. You proved that tonight. Our families are at risk. The children you teach are at risk. Training you to fight turns you into what they are. Elias's voice remained steady, but held an edge. Violence breeds violence. I won't be responsible for that cycle. Mary stood and approached him. She was small, barely reaching his shoulder, but her gaze held fierce determination. My children deserve to grow up safe. We're not asking you to make us killers. We're asking you to show us how to protect ourselves. The answer is no. They argued for another 20 minutes, pleading and reasoning, and finally accepting defeat. When they left, the farmhouse felt colder. Elias locked the door and returned to his chair by the lamp. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a small daguerreotype in a wooden frame. His wife, Catherine, photographed 6 months before she died. She wore a simple dress with her hair pulled back, and her hand rested on her swollen belly where their child grew. Neither had survived the difficult birth. That was the day he buried the Night Sparrow, along with his family. That was the day he swore never to let violence define him again. Elias picked up a book, Marcus Aurelius, worn from repeated reading, and tried to focus on the words, but the text blurred. His mind kept returning to the crossroads, to the precision of his hands, to how easily old instincts had surfaced. A soft knock came at the door near midnight. Elias rose carefully, approaching without making sound. Who's there? Please, sir. A young voice, nervous and strained. I need to speak with you. My name's Silas Boone. The name meant nothing to Elias. He opened the door a crack, keeping his body positioned to close it quickly if needed. A teenage boy stood on the porch, maybe 16, lean and gangly, with sandy hair that stuck out in all directions. He wore simple farmer's clothes and clutched his hat in trembling hands. I was with them tonight, Silas said quickly, at the crossroad, but I didn't want to be. They made me ride because my father's a member, and I'm supposed to learn the ways. But I recognized you, Mr. Cross. You saved my life 8 years ago. Elias studied the boy's face, searching his memory. Then recognition flickered. A bandit raid on a settlement near the Arkansas border. A terrified child hiding under a wagon while gunfire tore through the camp. Elias had found him during the chaos, carried him to safety before the outlaws burned everything. You were much smaller then, Elias said. "You pulled me from under that wagon. You told me to be brave and run toward the trees." Silas's voice shook. "I never forgot your face. When I saw you tonight, even with the spectacles, I knew it was you. The night sparrow. That name is dead. It needs to live again." Silas glanced over his shoulder at the dark road. "They're planning something worse than tonight. The Klan's organizing a siege on Dunbar Hollow. They've got military tactics. Former Confederate officers are leading them. They're treating this like a battlefield campaign." Elias stepped aside. "Come in. Quickly." Silas entered, and Elias locked the door behind him. The boy stood in the center of the room, twisting his hat in his hands. Outside, the crickets that had been chirping steadily fell silent all at once. "Tell me everything," Elias said. Silas spoke rapidly, describing coordination meetings, supply caches, planned attack routes. The Klan wasn't just angry. They were organizing with calculated precision. They intended to erase Dunbar Hollow as an example to other black communities. "I can get you more information," Silas finished. "Maps, schedules, numbers. But if they catch me helping you, they'll kill me. My own father would probably do it himself. Why risk that?" The boy met his eyes directly. "Because you saved me when you didn't have to. Because what they're planning is wrong. Because I don't want to become what they are." Elias walked to the window, looking out at the darkness. Somewhere in those shadows, 500 riders were regrouping, planning their next move. And somewhere in that mass of violence was this boy's father, raising his son to perpetuate hatred. "Go home," Elias said finally. "Be careful. If you can bring information without endangering yourself, do it. But don't take foolish risks." "I'll come back in 3 days," Silas promised, "with everything I can gather." He slipped out into the night, disappearing down the path like smoke. Elias watched until he was certain the boy was gone, then extinguished the lamp. Darkness filled the farmhouse. He stood in his doorway, looking out at the star-filled sky. Sleep wouldn't come tonight. His mind was already working through tactical scenarios, analyzing threats, calculating responses. The night sparrow stirred in the darkness, unwanted, but necessary. Morning light slanted through the schoolhouse windows, casting golden rectangles across worn floorboards. Elias stood at the front of the classroom, chalk in hand, explaining multiplication tables to 23 children who sat at their benches with varying degrees of attention. His voice remained steady and patient as always, but his eyes kept drifting toward the windows. "If you have 4 baskets," he said, writing numbers on the slate board, "and each basket holds 6 apples, how many apples do you have total?" Hands shot up. A girl in the front row called out, "24. "Correct, Anna." Elias wrote the answer. "Now, if you give away 2 baskets, how many apples remain?" He continued the lesson mechanically, but part of his mind tracked details beyond the classroom walls. The wind shifted from southeast to southwest around mid-morning. Birds that normally sang in the nearby pines fell quiet for several minutes before resuming their calls. A dust cloud rose along the northern road around noon. Riders passing, but too distant to identify. Silas had promised to return in 3 days. This was the 3rd day. The children worked through arithmetic problems while Elias walked between their benches, checking their slates. His movements appeared relaxed, but he positioned himself near windows frequently, scanning the tree line that bordered the schoolyard. Nothing moved except wind-stirred branches and occasional crows. Lunchtime came. The children ate outside in the shade, while Elias stood on the schoolhouse steps, watching. Parents sometimes visited during lunch to bring food or check on younger siblings. Today the road remained empty. The isolation felt deliberate, as if the world beyond Dunbar Hollow was holding its breath. Afternoon lessons dragged. Elias taught reading from a worn copy of Aesop's Fables, having the older students take turns reciting passages aloud. A boy named Marcus read about the tortoise and the hare, stumbling over longer words but pushing through with determination. The other children listened quietly. The story familiar, but still engaging. Through the window behind Marcus, Elias watched a hawk circle high above the fields. It rode thermal currents, wings spread wide, hunting, patient, calculating. When it spotted prey, it would strike with devastating precision, then return to stillness. 3 o'clock arrived. Elias dismissed the students, watching as they filed out, chattering and laughing. Some headed toward family farms. Others walked together into the main part of town where parents waited. Within 15 minutes, the schoolyard stood empty, except for Elias. He locked the schoolhouse door and began walking through Dunbar Hollow. The town stretched along both sides of a central road, maybe 40 families total, most living in small wooden houses with gardens and livestock pens. Beyond the homes lay farmland where cotton and corn grew in neat rows. Samuel worked in his blacksmith shop, hammer ringing against anvil as he shaped horseshoes. He nodded to Elias through the open doorway, face gleaming with sweat. In the adjacent lot, Mary hung laundry on a line strung between posts, her children playing nearby with a ball made from bundled rags. Elias continued walking, observing. Thomas repaired a section of fence around his property, replacing rotted posts with fresh-cut pine. The Harris family harvested early vegetables from their garden, turnips and carrots that would help feed them through winter. Old Man Fletcher sat on his porch, whittling, creating small wooden animals that he gave to neighborhood children. Normal life continued around him. People worked and talked and planned for tomorrow, unaware of the threat gathering in the darkness beyond their small community. Elias wanted to warn them, to gather everyone, and explain what Silas had revealed about the clan's coordinated siege plans. But without confirmation, without proof, the warning would only create panic, and Silas had not returned. Elias reached the edge of town where farmland met forest. He stood at the boundary, looking toward the tree line where shadows lengthened as the sun descended. Somewhere beyond those trees, Silas was either delayed or in danger. Either possibility demanded action, but Elias had no clear target, no confirmed intelligence. He turned back toward his farmhouse, walking slowly as the sky shifted from blue to orange to deep purple. Families lit lanterns inside their homes, creating warm points of light against gathering darkness. Smoke rose from chimneys where dinner cooked. Children's voices called out final games before bedtime. Elias reached his property just as full night settled. He lit no lamps, preferring darkness while he thought through options. Silas might arrive late. The boy might have encountered delays, family obligations, unexpected clan meetings, difficulty accessing the information he promised. Patience was warranted. But Elias's instincts, the same instincts that kept him alive through years of dangerous work, screamed warnings. The silence felt wrong. The absence felt deliberate. He was preparing coffee when hoofbeats approached rapidly up the road. Elias moved to the window, staying back from the glass where lamplight wouldn't silhouette him. A single rider approached fast, slowing only as he reached the farmhouse gate. Thomas dismounted clumsily, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste. He ran to the door and pounded hard. "Elias! Elias! Open up!" Elias opened immediately. Thomas stumbled inside, breathing hard, eyes wild with fear and anger. "They took him," Thomas gasped. "The clan! They took Silas Boone!" Elias steadied the man with a hand on his shoulder. "Slow down. Tell me what happened." Thomas nodded, forcing himself to breathe more slowly. "Word came from a white farmer who sympathizes with us, man named Peterson, who lives near the county line. He saw clansmen dragging Silas Boone from his family's house this afternoon. They were accusing him of betrayal. Said he was helping you. Said he was a traitor to his own people." The words landed like physical blows. Elias's jaw tightened. Where did they take him? Their main encampment, 5 miles northwest. Peterson said they've got him tied to a post in the center of their camp. Thomas's voice shook. But that's not all. The Grand Marshal, man named Corbin Hale, issued a public proclamation. He's demanding you surrender yourself by tomorrow sundown, or they'll burn Dunbar Hollow to the ground. He said Silas dies either way, but the town only survives if you give yourself up. Elias turned away, his mind racing through implications. Silas had tried to defect, had gathered information to help protect Dunbar Hollow, and was caught. Now the boy would pay the price for courage, while Elias faced an impossible choice: sacrifice himself to save the town, or fight back and risk everything. "There's more," Thomas added quietly. Hale posted copies of the proclamation in 3 counties. He wants everyone to know he's making an example. He wants other black communities to see what happens when they resist. Elias walked to his bedroom without speaking. Thomas followed uncertainly, standing in the doorway as Elias knelt beside his bed. He reached underneath and pulled out a long wooden chest, setting it on the floor with reverence. The lock had gathered dust. Elias wiped it clean, then retrieved a small key from inside his Bible. The lock clicked open. Inside the chest lay his past, carefully preserved. 2 revolvers rested in custom-fitted compartments, Colt single-action Army models, .45 caliber, with walnut grips worn smooth from years of use. Beside them, ammunition boxes, cleaning kits, leather holsters darkened with age and oil. A gun belt folded beneath everything, its buckle tarnished but solid. Elias lifted one revolver, feeling its familiar weight. The metal was cold against his palm. He checked the cylinder automatically, empty, as it had been for years, then tested the action. The hammer moved smoothly, the trigger crisp and clean despite long storage. "Elias?" Thomas's voice was uncertain. "What are you going to do?" "What? I have to." Elias set down the first revolver and picked up the second, examining it with the same careful attention. No rust, no damage. The weapons had waited patiently, like faithful dogs hoping their master would return. He lifted the gun belt, running his fingers along the leather. How many miles had he walked wearing this? How many towns had he entered with these weapons holstered at his sides? How many men had seen them and chosen surrender over violence? And how many had chosen violence anyway? "If you go after Silas alone, they'll kill you both," Thomas said. 500 men, Elias. Maybe more now. You can't— I'm not going after him yet. Elias stood, holding the revolvers. First I need to understand their defenses, their patrol patterns, how they've positioned sentries around the camp. Rushing in blind gets us both killed, and leaves Dunbar Hollow defenseless. He moved to his small table, and began the methodical process of cleaning weapons that didn't need cleaning. The ritual steadied him, providing familiar motions while his mind worked through tactical considerations. Oil on the cloth, wipe down the barrel, check each chamber, polish the grip. Thomas watched in silence for several minutes before speaking. "You're really him. The Night Sparrow. All those stories about the gunslinger who dismantled gangs single-handedly, those were you. Those were a different man." Elias worked oil into the revolver's mechanism. "A man I buried along with my wife and child. But you kept the guns." "I kept them because I knew peace is fragile." Elias set down the first revolver and picked up the second. "Because I understood that wanting something and having it are different things. I wanted to leave violence behind, but violence doesn't always allow that choice." He finished cleaning both weapons as full darkness settled outside. Thomas departed with promises to warn other families, to prepare them for what might come. Elias locked the door behind him and stood alone in his farmhouse, surrounded by the tools of his former life. On the mantel, Catherine's daguerreotype watched him with her gentle smile. What would she think of this moment? Would she understand the necessity, or would she see only the betrayal of everything he'd promised at her graveside? Elias picked up the photograph, studying her face in the dim light. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I tried. But they've forced this. He set the photograph back carefully, then lifted his gun belt. The leather settled around his waist with disturbing familiarity, as if no time had passed at all. He slid the revolvers into their holsters, testing the draw. His hands moved with muscle memory, smooth, fast, precise. The night sparrow lived again. Elias walked outside into cool night air. Stars blazed overhead, indifferent to human struggles. He moved past his small barn, past the garden where vegetables grew in neat rows, past the property line where his land met unclaimed forest. At the edge of town, he stopped and looked northwest. 5 miles distant, barely visible through the trees, orange points of light marked the clan encampment, campfires burning, men gathering. Silas Boone tied to a post, waiting for death or rescue. Elias stood motionless, feeling the weight of the revolvers at his sides. Reclaiming this identity might cost him the peace he'd fought so hard to build. It might transform him back into the weapon he'd sworn never to be again. But doing nothing would destroy Dunbar Hollow and condemn a brave boy to death for choosing conscience over hatred. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. He adjusted the gun belt, settling it more comfortably. Then he turned and walked back toward his farmhouse, mind already working through reconnaissance plans. Tomorrow, he would scout their camp, learn their patterns, find their weaknesses, and then he would show them why the night sparrow had been feared across 3 states. Dawn broke pale and cold across Dunbar Hollow. Elias stood outside the old church, watching families arrive in small groups. They came quietly, moving with the careful tension of people who understood danger without needing explanation. Thomas had spread word through the night. Now 30 adults gathered in the church's main room, their faces showing fear mixed with determination. The church was a simple structure, weathered wood, hand-built pews, a single cross mounted on the front wall. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the walls, creating stripes of gold across the floor. Children had been sent to stay with trusted neighbors. This meeting was for those who would fight, if fighting became necessary. Elias stood at the front, still wearing his teacher's clothes, but with the gun belt visible at his waist. The revolvers drew eyes. Nobody spoke until he began. "Silas Boone was captured yesterday," Elias said. His voice carried clearly through the small space. "The clan is holding him at their main encampment. They've issued an ultimatum. I surrender by sundown today, or they attack Dunbar Hollow." Murmurs spread through the crowd. A woman named Rebecca spoke first. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to teach you how to defend yourselves," Elias replied. "And then I'm going to get Silas back." A man named Samuel stood. "Against 500 riders? That's suicide." "Maybe, but letting them burn our homes without resistance is guaranteed destruction." Elias moved to a crude map someone had drawn on brown paper, showing Dunbar Hollow's layout. "They expect us to panic. They expect me to either surrender or run. We're going to do neither." He pointed to the town's eastern approach, where a narrow road passed through dense forest. "This is our strongest defensive position. Trees create natural choke points. Riders can't spread out in formation here. They have to funnel through, which limits their numbers." Martha, a widow who ran the general store, raised her hand. "You're talking about an ambush." "I'm talking about defense," Elias corrected. "If they come, they'll expect easy targets. We give them obstacles instead." He traced his finger along the western edge of town. "Here, we have open ground. Our weakest point. We need to create barriers, fallen trees, ditches, anything that forces them to slow down and bunch together." For the next hour, Elias outlined defensive strategies with the calm precision of a military planner. He explained how to use terrain advantages, how to position defenders to cover multiple angles, how to create the illusion of greater numbers through sound and movement. The residents listened intensely, some taking notes on scraps of paper. Sound matters as much as bullets, Elias told them. Gunshots echo. If 3 people fire from different positions in sequence, it sounds like 6 or 7. The clan relies on intimidation through numbers. We counter by making them uncertain about our strength. When the meeting ended, Elias led groups outside for practical training. He divided them by experience, those who owned firearms versus those who had never fired a weapon. The experienced shooters received advanced instruction. The novices got basic safety lessons. At a clearing behind the church, Elias set up training stations. He used fallen logs as barricades, teaching people how to fire from cover without exposing themselves unnecessarily. Don't aim to kill, he emphasized repeatedly. Aim to stop. A wounded attacker retreats. A dead one brings reinforcements, seeking revenge. He demonstrated reloading techniques, showing how to keep ammunition accessible and hands steady under pressure. Count your shots, he instructed. Know when you're empty before you click on nothing. That pause gets you killed. A young man named Isaiah showed natural talent, his movements smooth and confident. Elias worked with him extensively, teaching blind firing techniques, shooting around corners without exposing your head, using mirrors and reflections to track movement, anticipating enemy positions through sound. You're thinking like a gunfighter already, Elias observed. That's good. Remember, patience beats speed when you're defending. Let them come to you. Make them cross open ground while you stay protected. Throughout the morning, Elias moved between groups, correcting stances, adjusting grips, explaining tactical concepts. He taught them to build sound traps, strings tied to tin cans that would alert defenders to approaching riders. He showed them how to position themselves for crossfire without endangering each other. By midday, the training intensified. Elias set up mock scenarios, having some residents play attackers while others defended. He critiqued every movement, every decision. You fired too early. You revealed your position before you had a clear target. Wait until they're committed to their approach. Make every shot count. Rebecca proved surprisingly capable, her hands steady and her tactical thinking sharp. My husband was a soldier, she explained quietly. He taught me before he died. Then you teach others, Elias said. We need leaders at every position. By afternoon, patterns had emerged. The residents moved with more confidence, understanding basic defensive principles. They wouldn't match trained fighters, but they could make attacking Dunbar Hollow costly enough to give the clan pause. After the training session ended, Elias slipped away alone. He entered the forest northwest of town, moving silently through underbrush. His gunslinger instincts awakened fully now, reading tracks, interpreting broken branches, sensing disturbances in natural patterns. He found horse tracks along an old logging road. Multiple riders, recent passage. The tracks headed northwest toward the clan encampment. Elias followed carefully, staying off the main path, using trees for cover. The forest told stories to those who knew how to listen. Boot prints near a creek showed where scouts had watered horses. Disturbed moss indicated regular patrols. Elias memorized everything. The spacing between trees that would allow or prevent mounted charges, the sight lines from elevated positions, the natural corridors riders would favor. He discovered 3 separate paths the clan could use to approach Dunbar Hollow. Each presented different tactical challenges. The eastern route through dense forest would slow them, but provide cover. The western approach across open farmland offered speed, but no protection. The southern trail crossed a shallow creek that would force riders to bunch together. Elias mentally mapped defensive positions for each route. Where to place shooters, where to create obstacles, how to funnel attackers into killing zones while maintaining escape routes for defenders. He climbed a tall oak tree, gaining elevated perspective. From this vantage point, he could see smoke rising from the clan encampment to the northwest. Distance was difficult to judge through the trees, but Elias estimated 4 to 5 miles, close enough for a quick attack, far enough that residents might have warning if scouts spotted movement. As sunset approached, Elias descended and began the careful journey back to Dunbar Hollow. He moved like a shadow, pausing frequently to listen for patrols. Once, he heard distant hoofbeats and froze behind a massive pine trunk until the sound faded. Darkness had nearly fallen when he reached his farmhouse. Inside, he lit a single lamp and spread the map Silas had shown him across his small table. The boy had sketched the clan encampment layout from memory: tent positions, weapon storage, patrol patterns, leadership quarters. Elias studied every detail, comparing Silas's information against what he'd observed today. The encampment sat in a natural clearing, protected on 3 sides by thick forest. Only the southern approach offered relatively open ground. Getting in unseen would require moving through heavily patrolled woods. Getting out with Silas would be even harder. Time was running out. Sundown tomorrow was the deadline. If Elias didn't surrender, the attack would come. Silas would die, regardless. Corbin Hale had made that clear. The boy was marked for execution as an example. But Elias had no intention of surrendering, and he had no intention of letting Silas die. Dawn came cold and pale. Elias stood in his kitchen, methodically checking ammunition. He laid out each revolver on the table, his primary weapons, cleaned and oiled the night before. Beside them, boxes of cartridges sat open. He counted rounds with the precision of someone whose life had often depended on exact numbers. 48 rounds for the revolvers, a rifle with 20 cartridges, 2 knives, 1 strapped to his belt, another hidden in his boot. He wore dark, plain clothing that would help him blend into any crowd. The teacher's spectacles stayed behind. Today he needed the gunslinger's sharp eyes. Outside, his horse waited, already saddled. Elias had risen before first light to prepare. The animal sensed his tension, shifting weight nervously as Elias secured saddlebags containing basic supplies: dried meat, a water flask, extra ammunition wrapped in cloth to prevent rattling. He mounted quietly and rode out of Dunbar Hollow, while most residents still slept. Only a few early risers noticed him pass. Rebecca stood in her doorway, watching. She didn't wave. Neither did Elias. They both understood what this journey meant. The ride took him northeast, away from the clan encampment, toward a cluster of small towns where white settlers conducted regular business. Elias knew these places from his teaching travels. He'd delivered books to churches, spoken with merchants about supplies. His face was familiar enough not to draw immediate suspicion, especially if he kept his head down and spoke carefully. By mid-morning, he reached the first town, a collection of wooden buildings surrounding a muddy central square. Elias tied his horse outside a general store and entered, moving with the unhurried pace of someone running ordinary errands. The shopkeeper, an older man named Higgins, glanced up briefly, then returned to stocking shelves. "Morning?" Elias said quietly. Higgins grunted acknowledgement. No hostility, but no warmth either. Elias browsed slowly, listening. 3 men stood near the counter discussing local news. Their conversation drifted naturally toward recent events. "Heard the clan grabbed themselves a traitor," one man said. "Young Boone boy." "Silas. That family's always been trouble," another replied. "Father dead, mother gone. Boy had no discipline. They say he was feeding information to that colored teacher over in Dunbar Hollow, the one who scattered 500 riders single-handed. The third man spat tobacco juice into a can. That story's exaggerated. No single man defeats those numbers. Believe what you want. My cousin rode with them. Said he saw it himself. Teacher moved like a demon, dropping men without killing, using tricks nobody'd seen before. Elias kept his expression neutral, examining a bag of cornmeal. He purchased it along with some basic provisions, exchanged minimal conversation with Higgins, then left. The information confirmed Silas was still alive, still being held. No mention of execution yet, which meant Corbin Hale was using the boy as bait. The second town proved similar. Elias stopped at a blacksmith's shop, ostensibly to check his horse's shoes. While the smith worked, Elias overheard workers discussing the upcoming assault on Dunbar Hollow. They spoke casually, as if discussing a hunting trip. The violence ahead was entertainment to them, a righteous cleansing. It turned Elias's stomach, but he kept his face calm, his responses brief. "When they planning to move?" someone asked. "After sundown tomorrow, I heard. Give that teacher time to sweat. Then burn the whole settlement if he don't surrender." Elias paid the blacksmith and rode on. The timeline matched what he'd expected. 1 full day to prepare, then the attack would come. Rescuing Silas before then became increasingly critical. By early afternoon, Elias reached his true destination, a remote safe house 5 miles west of the nearest town. The structure sat abandoned now, a small cabin hidden deep in forest, where outlaws once regrouped between raids. Elias knew it from his Night Sparrow days. He'd raided it once, years ago, driving out a gang that had terrorized frontier settlements. The cabin door hung crooked on broken hinges. Inside, dust covered everything. Elias moved carefully, checking for recent occupation. The place appeared untouched for months, maybe years, perfect for hiding sensitive information. Silas had mentioned this location during their brief meeting. "If anything happens to me," the boy had said, "check the old outlaw cabin near Blackwater Creek. I left something there." Elias searched methodically. The main room revealed nothing. The back corner, where a crude sleeping area had been, showed signs of recent disturbance. Someone had lifted the floorboards. Elias knelt and pried them up carefully. Beneath, wrapped in oilcloth, lay several pieces of paper. Elias lifted them into the light. Sketches, detailed, careful drawings made by someone with sharp observational skills. Silas had created maps of clan infrastructure across 3 counties. Each page showed different strategic assets: armories marked with weapon counts, guarded trails with notation about patrol schedules, supply depots labeled with inventory estimates. One map depicted the main encampment in meticulous detail. Silas had drawn tent positions, marked leadership quarters, indicated weapons storage locations, and noted vulnerable points in the perimeter. Guard rotations were documented by time and position. Paths through surrounding forest showed which routes patrols used and which they ignored. Another sketch revealed a network of safe houses the clan maintained for emergency regrouping. Silas had identified at least 7 locations, complete with distances between them and likely occupancy numbers. The final page showed something particularly valuable: a supply schedule. Weapons shipments arrived on specific dates from specific sources. Ammunition deliveries followed predictable patterns. Silas had even documented which merchants cooperated willingly versus which were coerced. Elias studied each page carefully, committing details to memory. This intelligence transformed Silas from a troubled teenager into a strategic asset of immense value. The boy had risked everything gathering this information, likely over months of secret observation. His capture wasn't just personal tragedy. It was tactical catastrophe. If the clan forced him to reveal how much he knew, how much he documented, they'd change everything. Move weapons, alter routes, accelerate plans. Rescuing Silas became doubly critical. The boy's knowledge could dismantle clan operations across the entire region, but only if he survived long enough to share it with authorities who would act. Elias carefully rewrapped the papers and secured them in his saddlebag. He left the cabin as he'd found it, erasing signs of his presence. The ride back to Dunbar Hollow took several hours. Sunset painted the sky orange and red as he approached familiar territory. Several elders waited at the church when Elias arrived. Rebecca stood among them, along with Samuel, Martha, and Isaiah. They'd anticipated his return, knowing decisions needed making. Elias dismounted and led them inside. By lamplight, he spread Silas's maps across a table. The elders leaned close, studying the detailed intelligence. Silas Boone created these, Elias explained. He's been documenting clan operations for months, maybe longer. This information shows weapon locations, patrol patterns, supply lines, everything needed to coordinate a real resistance. Samuel traced one of the routes with his finger. This is more than one boy could gather alone. He's observant, patient, smart. Elias pointed to the main encampment map. He knew exactly what information mattered, and he risked his life collecting it. Martha looked up sharply. You're saying we need him alive for more than just moral reasons. I'm saying losing him means losing the only person who can verify all this intelligence. The maps help us defend Dunbar Hollow, but they could help authorities dismantle the clan entirely if properly used. Silas knows details that aren't written down, conversations he overheard, weaknesses he observed, connections between leaders. Rebecca crossed her arms. You're planning the rescue. I am. When? Tonight. The elders exchanged glances. Isaiah spoke quietly. That's suicide. The encampment will be heavily guarded, especially now that they're preparing for the assault tomorrow. Which is exactly why tonight works, Elias countered. They're focused outward, planning their attack on us. They won't expect someone moving inward toward them. And they certainly won't expect a single man attempting infiltration. Samuel shook his head. Even with your skills, the odds are impossible. The odds were impossible 2 days ago when I faced 500 riders, Elias replied. I'm still here. Silence settled over the group. Finally, Rebecca spoke. What do you need from us? Keep preparing defenses. If I fail, you'll face the assault tomorrow without me. Everything I taught you still applies. Use the terrain, create obstacles, make them uncertain about your numbers. Don't try to win. Just survive long enough for help to arrive. What help? Martha asked. Federal marshals. I sent word 3 days ago through a trusted contact. They're slow, but they'll come eventually. You just need to hold out. The elders nodded slowly, accepting the grim reality. Elias rolled up the maps and secured them in his coat. If something happens to me, these go to the marshals. They're evidence of organized terror across multiple counties. That brings federal intervention. He left the church and returned to his farmhouse. Inside, he laid out his weapons with the same methodical care he'd shown that morning. But now the preparation carried finality. This might be the last time he performed this ritual. Elias sharpened both knives on a whetstone, testing edges against his thumb. The blades gleamed in lamplight. He cleaned both revolvers again, checking every mechanism, ensuring smooth action. Each cylinder rotated perfectly. Each hammer fell with satisfying precision. He loaded the weapons fully, then checked his clothing for tears or loose fabric that might catch on branches during movement through forest. Everything had to be perfect. One mistake would end not just his life, but any chance of saving Silas or protecting Dunbar Hollow. Full darkness settled over the Mississippi countryside. No moon yet, just stars scattered across black sky. Elias rode slowly through pine forest, following deer trails that wouldn't show hoof prints come morning. His horse moved carefully, trained years ago to step quietly even in unfamiliar terrain. The encampment lay 3 miles ahead according to Silas's maps. Elias had memorized every detail. Tent positions, guard rotations, weapon storage locations, but maps only showed static information. Real reconnaissance required observation, patience, understanding how living systems actually functioned versus how they appeared on paper. He dismounted a mile out and tethered his horse to a low branch near a creek. The animal could drink if needed, rest until his return. Elias continued on foot, moving through underbrush with practiced silence. Each step required consideration. where weight distributed, which branches might snap, what sounds the wind already made that could mask his movement. Firelight appeared through trees ahead. Elias slowed further, dropping into a crouch. He circled the encampment's perimeter first, staying in darkness beyond lantern reach. His eyes adjusted fully, letting him see shapes and movements others would miss. The camp followed Silas's map almost exactly. 37 tents arranged in rough rows. Leadership quarters occupied the center. Larger canvas structures with guards posted outside. Weapon storage sat along the eastern edge in reinforced wagons covered by tarps. And there, separated from main camp by about 50 yards, stood a small wooden shack with 2 guards stationed at its door. That had to be where they kept Silas. Elias watched guard rotations for 20 minutes, counting intervals. Patrols circled the camp every 12 minutes. 2 men per patrol, walking opposite directions. When they passed each other near the shack, both had their backs to the structure for approximately 15 seconds. Lanterns hung from posts at regular intervals, creating pools of light with shadows between. Elias noted each position, calculating firing angles. The lanterns used kerosene, which meant they'd burn bright when shot, but wouldn't explode dramatically. Just enough disruption to create confusion without raising immediate alarm. He needed to draw guards away from the shack first, then create darkness near it, then move during patrol overlap. 3 actions requiring perfect timing and misdirection. Elias positioned himself behind a fallen log on the camp's northern edge. He drew 1 revolver, sighted carefully on a lantern post near the leadership tents, far from the shack, far from his actual target. The shot would wake the entire camp, but that was intentional. He fired. The lantern shattered. Kerosene spilled down the post, flames spreading across wood. Men shouted, scrambling from tents. Guards abandoned their positions, rushing toward the fire. Someone yelled about attackers, about finding cover, about organizing response. Elias moved immediately, circling wide through darkness while they focused on the flames. He reached the camp's eastern edge unseen, took position behind the weapon wagons. From here, he had clear sight on 3 more lanterns, all near the shack. The patrols reorganized quickly, moving toward the disturbance. Good discipline, but predictable. They left the shack area with minimal coverage, assuming any attacker would press the advantage at the fire location. Elias waited for the next patrol overlap. 2 guards passed each other, backs to the shack. 15 seconds. He fired 3 rapid shots. 3 lanterns exploded. Darkness swallowed that section of camp. The guards at the shack door turned toward the sound, hands reaching for weapons but uncertain which direction trouble actually came from. Elias moved during their confusion, crossing open ground in complete silence. He reached the shack's side wall before either guard fully processed what happened. The first man turned back toward his post. Elias struck him hard behind the ear with his revolver's grip. The guard dropped without sound. The second guard heard the body fall and spun around. Elias was already there, knife reversed in his left hand. He struck the guard's temple with the pommel, precise, controlled, non-lethal. The man collapsed beside his partner. Elias dragged both bodies into shadow, then tried the shack door, locked from outside with a simple bar. He lifted it carefully and slipped inside. Darkness filled the interior. Elias waited for his eyes to adjust. Slowly, shapes emerged. A figure sat slumped against the far wall, wrists bound to an iron ring bolted into timber. "Silas," Elias whispered. The figure jerked upright. "Mr. Cross? Don't speak loud. Can you stand?" "I think so." Elias crossed the small space and cut the ropes binding Silas's wrists. The boy groaned softly as circulation returned to his hands. Elias pulled him upright carefully, checking for serious injuries. Bruises covered Silas's face. His shirt showed bloodstains, but he could move, could walk. "We're leaving now," Elias said. "Stay close. Do exactly what I do." He handed Silas a spare pistol from his belt. "You remember how to use this?" "Yes, sir." "Don't fire, unless I tell you. We're trying to leave quietly." They moved to the door. Elias checked outside, guards still unconscious, camp still focused on the distant fire. Patrols searched the northern perimeter, where the first shot originated. Perfect misdirection. Elias led Silas into darkness, moving away from camp through the same route he'd entered. They reached the forest edge without detection. Behind them, men shouted orders, organized searches, tried to understand what happened. But Elias and Silas were already gone, slipping between trees like ghosts. They climbed higher ground, working up a ridge that overlooked the encampment from about 300 yards. Elias stopped at the crest, breathing controlled despite the exertion. Silas leaned against a tree, exhausted but alert. Below, the camp continued its confused response. Men gathered near the burned lantern post. Leaders emerged from tents, demanding explanation. And there, along the eastern edge, the ammunition wagons sat unguarded. Elias drew his second revolver. This shot required different calculation: distance, wind, trajectory, target size. He needed to hit a specific point on the nearest wagon where Silas's maps indicated they stored powder kegs. He sighted carefully, accounting for bullet drop over 300 yards. The target was small, barely visible in firelight. But Elias had made harder shots during his gunslinger years. Shots that required absolute precision, that allowed no margin for error. He exhaled slowly, squeezed the trigger between heartbeats. The bullet struck true. For a moment, nothing happened. Then orange flame erupted from the wagon's interior. The initial explosion was contained, muffled by canvas and wood. But it ignited other munitions stored nearby. Secondary explosions followed, louder, brighter, sending debris skyward. Men screamed and scattered. The entire eastern section of camp erupted in chaos. Flames spread to adjacent wagons. More ammunition detonated. The carefully organized encampment dissolved into panic as their primary weapons cache destroyed itself. Elias lowered his revolver and turned away. Time to go. They descended the ridge's far side, moving quickly now that distance and chaos protected them. Elias's horse waited where he'd left it, calm despite the distant explosions. He mounted and pulled Silas up behind him. They rode toward Dunbar Hollow under emerging moonlight. Silas held tight, exhausted but alive. Behind them, orange glow lit the horizon where the clan encampment burned. Neither spoke during the ride. Words weren't necessary yet. Silas was safe. The immediate threat had been disrupted. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. But tonight, they'd won something precious: time and hope, and proof that even overwhelming force could be outmaneuvered by careful planning and precise execution. The familiar outlines of Dunbar Hollow appeared ahead as moon rose higher. Lanterns burned in windows despite the late hour. People had waited, watching, praying. They would see two riders approaching instead of one. They would know the rescue succeeded. The horizon behind them still glowed orange from burning ammunition wagons. Elias kept his horse at steady pace, despite exhaustion settling into his bones. Silas rode behind him, silent and gripping his waist. Neither had spoken since leaving the ridge. Dawn approached slowly, turning the eastern sky from black to deep blue to pale gray. Birds began morning songs in the trees, normal sounds suggesting a normal day. But as they drew closer to Dunbar Hollow, Elias noticed something wrong in the air. Smoke. Not cook-fire smoke from breakfast preparations. This was thicker, darker, rising in multiple columns that stained the lightening sky. Elias urged his horse faster. The animal sensed his tension and broke into a gallop. Trees blurred past. The road straightened as they approached town. Silas spoke first, voice tight with horror. "Mr. Cross, Elias saw it too. Dunbar Hollow burned. Not the entire town, but enough. Flames consumed buildings along the main road. The general store's roof had collapsed inward, sending sparks skyward. The church steeple listed dangerously, its base blackened by fire. Houses showed broken windows, kicked-in doors, scattered belongings in yards. People moved through the destruction like ghosts. Some carried water buckets in chains, fighting fires that had already won. Others searched through debris, calling names of missing family members. Children sat crying in the dirt, while mothers tried comforting them with empty hands. Elias dismounted before his horse fully stopped. He helped Silas down, then rushed toward the nearest burning structure, the blacksmith's shop. Mr. Henderson stood outside, watching his livelihood disappear into flames, face blank with shock. "What happened?" Elias demanded. Henderson turned slowly, eyes unfocused. They came just after midnight. Different riders than yesterday. Maybe 50 of them. "We tried fighting back like you taught us, but—" He gestured helplessly at the destruction. "They had too many torches, too many guns. They weren't trying to fight. They just wanted to burn everything." Elias grabbed Henderson's shoulders. "Where are people hurt? Who needs help?" "Church basement. Dr. Morrison set up there. But Mr. Cross—" Henderson's voice broke. "They killed livestock, shot horses in their stables, poisoned the well behind the Taylor house. They wanted us to suffer." Elias released him and ran toward the church. Silas followed, limping from injuries but refusing to stay behind. They pushed through the church's main doors into chaos. People crowded the aisles, some bleeding, others coughing from smoke inhalation. Dr. Morrison moved between them with his medical bag, doing what he could with limited supplies. "Elias!" Morrison called out. "Thank God. I need hands. Mrs. Patterson has burns on her arms. Mr. Cole took a bullet through his shoulder. The Williams children breathed too much smoke." Elias went to work immediately. He helped Morrison clean wounds, apply bandages, comfort frightened children. His hands moved with practiced efficiency despite the emotional weight crushing his chest. Each injury represented his failure. Each terrified face accused him silently. He should have anticipated this, should have known the clan would split their forces. While he rescued Silas and destroyed one camp, another faction executed their real plan. The night rescue hadn't been a victory. It had been a distraction he fell for completely. Silas worked beside him, fetching water and holding supplies. The boy's face showed guilt that mirrored Elias's own. They'd been outsmarted, outmaneuvered. The very tactics Elias prided himself on had been turned against him. After an hour of treating injuries, Morrison pulled Elias aside. "We've stabilized everyone critical. But, Elias," the doctor's expression turned grave, "you need to see what they left at the schoolhouse." Elias's stomach dropped. "The schoolhouse? It's gone. Burned to foundations. But they left something there for you." Elias walked through devastated streets toward the school. Residents watched him pass, faces showing complex emotions, gratitude that he'd returned, anger that he'd left, hope that he could fix this, despair that nothing could be fixed. He met no one's eyes. The schoolhouse appeared ahead, or what remained of it. Blackened timbers jutted from ash piles like broken bones. The roof had completely collapsed. Desks Elias had carefully arranged lay charred and splintered. Books he'd purchased with his own money had become unreadable carbon. The chalkboard had cracked from heat. Its surface bubbled and ruined. In the center of the destruction, driven into the ground with force, stood a wooden post. A white cloth hung from it, unstained by smoke. Words had been painted across the fabric in crude black letters. "Surrender or watch them all burn the night. Sparrow dies or Dunbar. Hollow dies. Sunrise tomorrow at the old courthouse. Come alone." Below the message, they'd drawn a symbol, a sparrow with a bullet through its chest. Elias stared at the cloth, reading the words again and again. His breathing grew shallow. His hands trembled. Everything he'd worked for since abandoning his gunslinger life lay destroyed around him. The school where he'd taught children to read, the community he'd tried protecting, the peaceful existence he'd built from violence's ashes, all of it burning because of who he used to be. Footsteps approached from behind. Silas's voice came quiet. "Mr. Cross, this isn't your fault." "Yes, it is." Elias's voice sounded hollow in his own ears. "They came here because of me. Burned homes because of me. Hurt children because of me. They came here because they're evil men who hate us for existing. You didn't make them that way." Elias turned to face the boy. Silas stood covered in ash and dried blood, exhausted beyond measure, but his eyes burned with certainty. "You saved my life twice now," Silas continued. "You taught people how to defend themselves. You gave them hope when they had none. That message there?" He pointed at the cloth. "That's them admitting you scare them. They wouldn't demand surrender if they thought they could just kill you. They'll kill everyone here if I don't go. They'll kill everyone here either way. You know that. Men like them don't keep promises to people like us." Elias looked back at the destroyed schoolhouse. Silas was right, but the knowledge didn't ease the weight crushing his chest. Every choice led to death. Surrender meant his own execution and probably Dunbar Hollow's destruction anyway. Fighting meant more bloodshed, more suffering, possibly the same outcome. He walked into the ash pile, stepping carefully around collapsed timbers. The heat from yesterday's fire still radiated from the ground. He knelt in the center where his desk had once stood, where he'd taught grammar and history and mathematics to children who deserved better than this world gave them. His fingers touched ash, feeling its texture. Everything reduced to this: fine gray powder that stained his hands and blew away in the morning breeze. Books and desks and dreams all became identical in fire's aftermath. Morning light broke properly now, sun cresting the horizon and painting the destruction in golden tones that seemed mockingly beautiful. Elias knelt there as light grew stronger, surrounded by ashes, exhausted beyond words, devastated beyond measure. He didn't pray. He'd stopped praying when his wife and unborn child died, but he made himself a promise in that moment, kneeling in the ruins of everything he'd tried to build. The clan wanted the Night Sparrow. They'd get him, but not the version they expected, not the legend they'd heard stories about. Something colder, more calculated, more final. Elias stood from the ashes and walked through Dunbar Hollow as noon sun reached its peak. Heat pressed down on the burned town, making smoke smell stronger and ash stick to sweating skin. He moved slowly between buildings, cataloging damage with methodical precision. The general store, total loss. The blacksmith shop, roof gone, tools salvageable. 3 houses on the eastern road, burned to foundations. The church, structurally sound but smoke-damaged. The well behind the Taylor house, contaminated, unusable. Livestock losses, 17 horses, 23 cattle, countless chickens. He counted everything, recorded it all in his mind, made lists of what could be rebuilt and what was gone forever. People watched him pass. They didn't approach. Something in his posture warned them away. His face showed nothing now. No grief, no anger, just empty calculation. The schoolteacher had burned with the schoolhouse. What walked through Dunbar Hollow now was something else. Mrs. Patterson sat outside her damaged home, bandaged arms cradled against her chest. Her daughter Emily, one of Elias's best students, held her mother's hand and stared at him with wide, frightened eyes. Elias met the child's gaze for just a moment before looking away. He couldn't afford softness anymore. The Williams family searched through debris of their collapsed barn. Mr. Williams had taken a blow to the head during the attack and moved slowly, uncertain. His sons did most of the heavy lifting, pulling charred boards aside to reach trapped tools underneath. They paused when Elias approached, waiting for him to speak. He didn't. He simply noted their injuries and moved on. By the time he completed his circuit of the town, the sun had shifted westward. Elias walked to the edge of Dunbar Hollow, where land sloped down toward creek beds and pine forest. He stood there alone, staring at nothing, thinking about the cloth message at the schoolhouse: surrender, or watch them all burn. They'd given him until tomorrow's sunrise, roughly 18 hours. Behind him, footsteps approached. Multiple people. He didn't turn around. "Elias," Dr. Morrison's voice. "We need to talk." "Nothing to discuss." Elias kept staring at the tree line. "I know what has to be done." "Do you?" Morrison stepped beside him, followed by Henderson, Mrs. Patterson's husband Samuel, and several others. "Because the look on your face suggests you're planning something we won't like." Elias finally turned to face them. His expression remained flat, controlled. "I'm planning to end this. Permanently." "By doing what, exactly?" Samuel Patterson demanded. His wife's burns had left him angry, looking for targets. "By walking into their trap? By getting yourself killed and leaving us defenseless? By giving them what they asked for." Elias's voice carried no emotion. "The night sparrow." Morrison shook his head firmly. "That's not who you are anymore. You told us yourself. You left that life behind. That life came back whether I wanted it or not." Elias gestured at the burned buildings behind them. "This happened because I tried being someone I'm not. I thought I could protect people by teaching them to read, by showing them defensive tactics, by being gentle." His jaw tightened. "I was wrong." "You weren't wrong," Henderson interjected. "You gave us hope. You gave us skills. You showed us we could stand up. And they burned you down anyway." Elias cut him off. "Everything I taught you meant nothing when they decided to attack. You're alive because they chose to let you live, not because of anything I did." The group fell silent. Elias saw his words landing, saw doubt creeping into their expressions. Good. They needed to understand reality. Morrison tried again, voice softer. "Elias, listen to yourself. You're talking like a man who's already given up, who thinks violence is the only answer. Violence is the only language they understand." "Maybe, but you don't have to speak it the way they do." Morrison moved closer, forcing eye contact. "You saved Silas without killing anyone. You scattered 500 riders without mass slaughter. You've shown us there's a difference between protecting and destroying. And what did that restraint accomplish?" Elias's control cracked slightly, anger seeping through. "Silas nearly died. The town burned. Children are crying in church basements with burns and bullet wounds. My restraint cost them everything. Your restraint kept you human." This voice came from behind. Silas, approaching with several other townspeople. The boy looked exhausted, but determined. "That message at the schoolhouse? They want you angry. They want you reckless. They're baiting you into becoming exactly what they say you are." Elias studied the growing crowd. More residents had gathered, forming a semicircle around him. Old and young, wounded and whole, all watching with expressions that mixed fear and hope and desperate faith. "They're going to kill you all anyway," Elias said quietly. "Whether I surrender or fight, whether I show restraint or go to war. Men like them don't negotiate. They don't keep promises. They want us gone. Then help us fight smart." Silas stepped forward until he stood directly in front of Elias. "Not angry, not reckless. Smart. The way you taught us. The way the night sparrow actually fought. With his mind first, his gun second. My mind has limits, tactics, have limits. At some point, you just need more bullets than the other side. No. Silas shook his head firmly. You told me once that your wife hated what you became when you only used violence. That's why you stopped. That's why you came here to teach instead of fight. Are you really going to throw that away now? The mention of his wife hit harder than Elias expected. He turned away from the crowd, jaw working, fighting emotions he couldn't afford. She wouldn't want this, Silas continued, pressing his advantage. She wouldn't want you becoming something worse than them, just to beat them. Elias's hands curled into fists. His breathing came harder. The night sparrow whispered in his mind. Cold, efficient, ruthless. It would be so easy. Just embrace it fully. Stop holding back. Stop caring about casualties or consequences. Become the legend they feared. End this with overwhelming, merciless force. But another voice whispered too, softer. His wife's voice from memory, speaking words she'd said years ago. Your hands have power, but your heart has purpose. Don't lose the second trying to prove the first. I don't know how to beat them without becoming them, Elias admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Yes, you do. Morrison joined Silas, placing a hand on Elias's shoulder. You've always known. That's why you've survived this long when other gunslingers died young. You think. You plan. You find ways to win that don't require becoming a monster. Planning won't stop an army. No. But your mind combined with our courage might. Henderson stepped forward too. You're not alone in this, Elias. You never were. Stop trying to carry everything yourself. Elias looked at each face in the crowd, saw determination growing alongside fear, saw people ready to fight not because they wanted violence, but because they wanted survival, wanted dignity, wanted a future where their children didn't live in terror. The night sparrow whispered that using them would get them killed. That sentiment made soldiers careless, that caring about casualties meant losing wars. But Elias pushed that voice down, locked it away. These weren't soldiers. They were neighbors, friends, students, people who trusted him not just to save them, but to save them right, without losing his humanity in the process. Silas. Elias finally spoke, voice steadier. You said you know clan leadership locations. The boy nodded quickly. Yes, sir. My father took me to meetings before everything. I know where they gather, where they store weapons, how they organize. Then we need maps, detailed ones. Every location, every route, every weakness you can remember. Silas's face brightened with cautious hope. You're going to plan a strike. I'm going to plan several. Elias turned to address the full crowd. They want the Night Sparrow? They'll get tactics that made him legendary, but not the violence, not the killing. We're going to dismantle their operation piece by piece, smart and surgical. We're going to turn their own strategies against them. And we're going to prove that thinking beats brutality. Morrison smiled slightly. Now, that sounds like the Elias Cross, I know. Get everyone together, Elias ordered, authority returning to his voice. Able-bodied adults in the church. I need to see what we have. Weapons, ammunition, supplies, skills. Silas, start sketching those maps from memory. Henderson, inventory what tools survived the fires. Patterson, organize watches around town perimeter. Morrison, prepare medical supplies for wounded. We'll have more before this ends. People scattered to follow instructions, energy renewed by having clear direction. Silas hurried toward the church, already pulling paper from his coat pocket. Others dispersed to assigned tasks, moving with purpose instead of despair. Elias stood alone again, but differently now, not isolated by choice, not drowning in darkness, simply taking a moment to collect himself before the next phase began. The night sparrow still whispered in his mind, would always whisper. But Elias had learned long ago that the strongest thing a man could do wasn't embracing violence. It was choosing restraint, despite violence being easier. He walked toward the church as afternoon sun began its descent. The building's interior remained crowded with wounded and displaced families, but space had been cleared at the front, where tables stood. Silas was already spreading papers across the largest table, sketching rapidly from memory. Elias joined him, studying the emerging maps, clan meeting houses, armories, supply routes, leadership homes, patterns of patrol and timing of movements. Everything they needed to plan, a coordinated strike that would cripple organization without wholesale slaughter. Others gathered around the table as maps took shape. Henderson with tool inventories, Morrison with medical counts, Patterson with watch schedules, each person contributing pieces of information that formed a larger tactical picture. Elias's mind shifted into the mode that had made him legendary. Not the killing, the thinking. Seeing battlefields as puzzles, finding pressure points, identifying leverage, planning movements that turned enemy strength into weakness. He began marking the maps, explaining strategies, assigning roles. His voice carried calm authority that steadied everyone listening. This was who he truly was, not just a gunslinger, but a tactician. Not just a fighter, but a teacher, showing others how to win. The afternoon passed in focused planning. Elias spread more maps across the church table, each one detailed with locations and weaknesses Silas remembered. Dawn broke pale and cold over the old courthouse. Elias studied the building from the tree line. 3 stories of weathered brick and timber. Windows dark, surrounded by hitching posts where 24 horses stood tied. Smoke rose from chimneys. The clan leadership had gathered inside for their emergency council, just as Silas predicted. Beside Elias, Morrison checked his rifle nervously. Henderson carried rope and tools. Patterson held extra ammunition. 6 others waited further back, positioned according to Elias's careful instructions. None of them were soldiers. None of them wanted to be here, but all of them understood what failing meant. "Remember the plan," Elias said quietly. "No shooting unless I signal. Stay hidden until I've drawn them where we need them. This works because we think faster, not because we shoot more." Morrison nodded, throat tight. "And if it goes wrong?" "It won't." Elias's voice carried absolute certainty he didn't fully feel. "They're expecting violence. We're giving them precision." He'd spent the previous night preparing the courthouse carefully, entering through basement coal chutes, planting acoustic devices Henderson built from tin and wire, weakening structural supports on the second-floor balconies, positioning mirrors to create false reflections, rigging ropes through rafters. Everything designed to turn the building itself into a weapon of confusion and control. Now Elias moved forward alone, walking directly toward the front entrance. No stealth, no hiding. The sentries spotted him immediately. "That's him!" one shouted. "That's Cross!" Men poured from the courthouse entrance, armed riders in civilian clothes, masks left inside during daylight meetings. They formed a semicircle blocking Elias's approach, rifles raised. Elias stopped 20 yards away, hands visible but not raised. "I'm here to talk with your Grand Marshal." "You're here to die," one rider spat. "After what you did to our boys at the encampment?" "What I did was give them the chance to run. Most took it." Elias's voice carried easily across the distance. "Your Grand Marshal promised to burn Dunbar Hollow unless I surrendered. Well, here I am. Tell him to come face me himself instead of hiding behind armed children." The insult landed hard. Several riders tensed, fingers tightening on triggers. But before anyone could fire, the courthouse door opened again. Grand Marshal Thaddeus Crane emerged. Tall, silver-haired, wearing expensive clothes that marked him as plantation gentry. Behind him came a dozen more men, the leadership council Silas had described. All of them armed, all of them confident. Elias cross. Crane's voice dripped contempt. The famous night sparrow, come to surrender like a whipped dog. Come to talk terms, Elias corrected. Dunbar Hollow for me. That was your offer. Terms? Crane laughed. You think you have leverage? You're surrounded by 40 armed men. Your little settlement is defenseless. You have nothing to bargain with. Elias tilted his head slightly. The signal. From the tree line, Morrison fired a single shot that pinged off the courthouse bell, creating a deep metallic tone that rolled across the square. The clan riders spun toward the sound, rifles swinging, but the echo made locating the shooter impossible. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. That's one man in position, Elias said calmly. I have 20 more you can't see, all trained, all armed, all willing to die defending their homes. How many of your boys are willing to die protecting Crane's pride? Shoot him, Crane ordered. The nearest rider raised his rifle. Elias drew and fired in one fluid motion, not at the man, but at the rifle itself. The bullet struck the barrel near the trigger guard, tearing it from the rider's hands with enough force to spin him around. The rifle clattered to the ground, bent and useless. Elias's revolver was already aimed at the next rider before anyone else could react. Next man who points a weapon at me loses more than his gun, Elias said quietly. I'm done being patient. Crane's face darkened. You can't outshoot 40 men. No, but I can outthink them. Elias took a deliberate step forward. You gathered your leadership here because you thought you were safe, thought I wouldn't dare attack. But I've owned this building since midnight. Every step you take, every word you speak, I control it all. You're bluffing. Elias fired straight up. The shot rang loud, then echoed impossibly, bouncing through the acoustic traps he'd planted, multiplying into a dozen phantom gunshots that seemed to come from inside the courthouse itself. Men shouted in confusion, spinning toward the building, rifles pointing at windows where no shooters stood. Those are sound traps, Elias explained, already reloading. Tin and wire placed in your rafters. Every shot I fire will sound like an army. Your men won't know where to aim, won't know who's real and who's echo. Henderson emerged from behind the courthouse, striking a piece of metal that sent another cascading series of false gunshots through the building. Crane's men scattered, seeking cover, unsure where the threat actually existed. Inside! Crane shouted. Get inside where we can defend properly. The riders retreated toward the courthouse entrance, exactly as Elias predicted. He let them go, counting heads, watching positions. Crane and his council followed, confident that thick walls would protect them. Elias waited until the last man entered. Then he fired again, this time at a rope he'd strung across the entrance. The shot severed it cleanly. A heavy beam dropped across the doorway, blocking it shut from outside. Panicked shouts erupted from within. Men hammered on the door, but the beam held firm. Second-floor windows, Elias called to his volunteers. Now. Morrison and 3 others moved into position around the building's perimeter, rifles trained upward. Inside, clan members rushed to those windows, seeking escape routes or firing positions. Elias fired at the first man who appeared, not at him, but at the balcony support beneath his feet. The wood splintered. Elias fired again. Same spot. The third shot broke through completely. The balcony collapsed inward with a tremendous crash. Men tumbled backward into the courthouse interior, landing hard on the ground floor. No one died, but several lay groaning, injured and disarmed. Next balcony, Elias announced, already moving to a new angle. Anyone who shows themselves loses their footing. You can surrender now or keep falling. More faces appeared at windows, younger riders, terrified, unsure. Elias shot the supports beneath 2 more balconies in rapid succession, sending them crashing down. The courthouse interior filled with dust and screaming. Men who'd felt powerful minutes ago now scrambled through debris, weapons forgotten, concerned only with survival. "Cease fire!" someone inside shouted. "We surrender! Stop shooting!" But Elias wasn't done. He needed them completely broken, not just frightened. He fired at the courthouse bell again, creating another rolling echo that mixed with the acoustic traps. The sound became overwhelming. Impossible to distinguish real shots from false. Impossible to know how many attackers existed. Patterson circled to the building's rear, striking more metal plates. The noise compounded, building into a symphony of phantom warfare that made Crane's men cover their ears. Then Elias fired his final prepared shot, a long-distance strike at a lantern he'd positioned carefully in a third-floor window. The glass shattered. Oil spilled onto papers he'd soaked earlier. Smoke began rising, visible through the windows, though the fire was small and controlled. "The building's burning!" someone inside screamed. "It's not," Elias called back. "Just smoke. But it will burn if you don't come out peacefully. Front door, hands visible, weapons left inside. You have 1 minute." 30 seconds passed. Then the beam blocking the entrance shifted as men inside worked to move it. Elias kept his revolver ready, watching, calculating. The door opened. Men emerged slowly, hands raised, faces ashen. They looked like soldiers after a terrible battle, defeated and traumatized despite never facing a real assault. Crane came last, supported by 2 younger riders. His expensive suit was covered in dust. Blood ran from a cut on his forehead where falling debris struck him. His eyes found Elias with pure hatred. "You destroyed nothing," Crane spat. "Killed no one. This proves you're weak." "No," Elias corrected. "It proves I'm precise. I could have burned you alive, could have shot everyone who showed themselves, could have brought this building down on your heads. Instead, I gave you the chance to surrender with your lives intact. That's not weakness. That's control." Morrison and the other volunteers emerged from hiding, rifles trained on the prisoners. More townspeople arrived, summoned by the earlier signals, forming a perimeter. The clan members saw themselves surrounded and outnumbered by people they'd tormented for years. "You can't hold us," Crane said. "We have lawyers, judges, influence." "You had those things," Elias interrupted. "But I sent letters 5 days ago. Detailed letters with witness statements, documented attacks, evidence of conspiracy. Sent them to federal marshals in Jackson, to newspapers in Memphis, to congressional representatives in Washington." Crane's face went pale. "You're lying." "Am I?" Elias nodded toward the road. Dust clouds rose in the distance, riders approaching fast. As they drew closer, federal badges became visible on their coats. A dozen marshals, armed and official, responding to correspondence that outlined everything Silas knew and more. The lead marshal reined up, surveying the scene with professional assessment. "I'm Marshal Webb. We received communications regarding organized terror campaigns against freedmen settlements. Is this the leadership?" "Everyone," Elias confirmed. "Grand Marshal Crane, his council, and 40 riders, all present during multiple attacks on Dunbar Hollow. I have witnesses who will testify." Webb gestured to his men. "Take them into custody. Formal charges will follow." The arrests proceeded quickly. Crane protested, threatened, invoked names of powerful friends. But Webb's expression never changed. Federal authority outweighed local corruption. At least today. At least here. Elias watched the prisoners being bound and mounted on horses. Watched Crane's empire crumble without a single death required. Watched justice arrive not through violence, but through evidence, planning, and patience. Morrison approached, rifle lowered. "You really sent those letters days ago?" "The morning after Silas warned me," Elias confirmed. "I knew we couldn't win with guns alone. Needed law on our side. And if the marshals hadn't come, then this would have ended differently." Elias didn't elaborate. The prisoners were led away, A long column of defeated men headed toward federal custody. Townspeople watched in silence, processing the sight of their tormentors, reduced to criminals facing actual consequences. Webb approached Elias before departing. "Your letters were detailed, comprehensive. You've done this kind of documentation before." "I've seen what happens when violence isn't backed by law," Elias replied. "Bodies pile up, but nothing changes. Justice requires both force and structure." Webb nodded slowly. "We'll need you to testify. This case will be significant." "I'll be there." The marshal mounted and followed his prisoners, leaving Dunbar Hollow's people standing in the courthouse square. Morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last shadows. Elias holstered his revolvers, suddenly exhausted. He turned toward the courthouse entrance. Smoke still drifted from the upper window, though the small fire had already died. The building stood damaged but intact. Balconies collapsed, supports shattered, acoustic traps hanging useless from rafters. Patterson joined him. "What happens now?" "Now we rebuild," Elias said simply. "The schoolhouse first, then homes, then everything else they tried to destroy." He walked away from the courthouse, away from the scene of tactical victory, moving toward the road that led home. Townspeople followed, quiet but hopeful, seeing a future that might actually exist beyond constant fear. Elias emerged into full sunlight, leaving the courthouse behind. 1 week later, construction began in earnest. Elias stood in the church's main hall, watching children arrange themselves on borrowed benches. The temporary schoolhouse smelled of fresh sawdust and candle wax. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating young faces that had witnessed too much violence too soon. "Open your primers to page 12, Elias instructed, his voice calm and measured. 23 students complied, ranging from age 6 to 14. Some wore patched clothing. Others showed healing bruises from the night Dunbar Hollow burned. But every child held their book carefully, treating education like the precious gift it was. Silas Boone moved between rows, checking pronunciation and helping younger students sound out difficult words. The teenager had transformed in 7 days, shoulders straighter, voice steadier. No longer the frightened boy who'd warned Elias in secret. He wore simple clothing now instead of his family's expensive fabrics. His hands showed calluses from helping rebuild homes. "This word?" a girl asked, pointing. "Justice," Silas said quietly. "Means fairness under law. Means people getting what they deserve. Good or bad." Elias glanced up from his desk, meeting Silas's eyes briefly. The boy understood more than most adults about justice's complexities, how it required both force and restraint, how it demanded courage from unlikely sources. The morning lesson continued through reading, arithmetic, and basic geography. Elias maintained strict discipline but gentle encouragement. He asked questions that made students think rather than simply recite. He praised effort over perfection. At midday, the children broke for lunch. Elias and Silas remained inside, preparing afternoon materials. "My father sent another letter," Silas mentioned, not looking up from the papers he was organizing. "Says I've shamed the family. Says I'll inherit nothing. Does that trouble you?" "No." Silas's answer came quickly. "I'd rather have nothing and sleep peacefully than have everything and know it was built on terror." Elias nodded. "Your father may change. Men sometimes do when their power disappears. But even if he doesn't, you made the right choice." "I know." Silas finally looked up. "Because you showed me a different kind of strength. The kind that protects instead of destroys." Before Elias could respond, footsteps approached. Henderson entered, removing his hat respectfully. "Afternoon session's ready when you are." "We'll be there shortly," Elias confirmed. The afternoon brought a different kind of teaching. Behind the church, in a clearing surrounded by pine trees, 20 young adults gathered. Most were men, though several women stood among them. All had volunteered for defensive training, after watching their community nearly burn. Elias surveyed the group with the same careful assessment he'd used on clan formations. These weren't soldiers, weren't gunslingers. They were farmers, craftsmen, mothers, and sons who needed skills to protect themselves without becoming what they fought against. "Show me your stances," Elias instructed. The volunteers spread out, adopting positions he'd taught earlier in the week. Some stood too rigid, others too casual. Elias moved through the rows, making small corrections, adjusting a shoulder here, repositioning feet there. "Defensive shooting isn't about being fastest," he explained, repeating a lesson that bore constant reinforcement. "It's about being accurate when accuracy matters. It's about staying calm when others panic. Most importantly, it's about knowing when not to shoot." He demonstrated with an unloaded revolver, showing how to draw smoothly rather than quickly, how to aim center mass, how to account for wind and distance. The movements came naturally despite his desire to leave them behind. Muscle memory couldn't be unlearned. "But we're not here just for marksmanship," Elias continued, holstering the weapon. "Knowing how to fight means nothing if you can't think, can't plan, can't work together." Morrison stepped forward at Elias's signal, holding a crude map of the surrounding area. "This is tactical thinking, understanding terrain, knowing where people can approach from, where you have advantages, where you're vulnerable." The group gathered around as Morrison explained basic defensive positioning. Elias watched, letting his student teach, offering corrections only when necessary. This was how knowledge spread. Not through one expert, but through a community sharing skills. After an hour, they practiced reloading drills. Not firing, just the mechanical actions, opening cylinders, inserting rounds, closing smoothly. Repetition built familiarity. Familiarity reduced panic. "Why do we practice without bullets?" a young woman asked. "Because in a real crisis, your hands will shake," Elias answered. "Your breathing will quicken. Your thoughts will scatter. But if you've practiced these movements 1,000 times, your body remembers even when your mind doesn't. That's how you stay effective when fear arrives." Silas assisted with the drills, demonstrating proper technique. He'd never fired a gun before the night Elias rescued him, but he learned quickly, showing the same careful attention he brought to everything. As sunset approached, Elias called the session to an end. "Remember, these skills exist to protect, not to pursue. We defend what's ours. We don't become what we defeated." The volunteers dispersed slowly, talking among themselves, comparing techniques. Several approached Elias with questions. He answered each patiently, aware that knowledge given freely built trust that force never could. Later, as twilight painted the sky purple and gold, Elias walked through Dunbar Hollow's rebuilding center. New frames rose where homes once stood. Federal marshals maintained a visible presence, deterring further attacks. Children played in streets that had been silent with fear just days ago. Patterson waved from a roof he was repairing. "School construction starts tomorrow. Henderson and I measured the foundation this afternoon." "Good," Elias replied. "I'd like to help." "You've done enough fighting. Let us handle the building." "Building is fighting," Elias said. "Just a different kind." He continued walking until he reached the church construction site, where the new permanent schoolhouse would stand. Foundation stones lay in careful rows. Timber waited in organized stacks. Everything prepared for tomorrow's work. Someone had already erected a single beam, ceremonial, marking where the entrance would be. Elias approached it slowly, running his hand along the smooth wood. The grain felt solid under his fingers. Good timber, strong enough to last generations. He drew a knife from his belt, studying the unmarked surface. Then, carefully, he began carving. The letters came slowly, deliberate, each cut precise. D.H. 1876, Dunbar Hollow. The year they survived. The year they proved that communities built on justice could could withstand communities built on hate. Below the date, Elias carved more letters. E.C. Teacher, not gunslinger. Not Night Sparrow. Teacher. The identity he'd chosen. The role he'd reclaimed despite everything trying to destroy it. The carving took time. Sunset deepened into dusk as Elias worked, surrounded by the sounds of evening, crickets, distant conversation, a dog barking somewhere nearby. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds. When he finished, he stepped back to examine his work. The letters caught fading light, casting small shadows. Simple, honest, a marker that this place existed, that these people endured, that survival was possible even after everything suggested otherwise. Silas approached quietly, carrying 2 tin cups. Brought you water. Thank you. Elias accepted the cup, drinking slowly. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last sunlight fade. Somewhere nearby, a mother called her children home. A hammer struck wood as someone worked past dark. Life continuing, rebuilding, refusing to surrender to fear. What happens when the marshals leave? Silas asked eventually. We continue what we started, Elias replied. Teaching, building, defending if necessary, but not living in constant preparation for war. That's how we truly win, by refusing to let violence define us. And your guns? Elias touched the revolvers at his belt. I'll store them, not destroy them. We're not naive, but store them. Let them gather dust while I gather students. The Night Sparrow? Retired. The word felt heavy but right. That identity served its purpose, saved lives when saving required violence. But I'm done being defined by what I can destroy. I'd rather be remembered for what I helped build. Silas nodded slowly. I want to help you. Teaching, I mean. Not just assisting. Actually becoming a teacher myself. Then you'll need education, Elias said. Real education. I can teach you, but it'll take years. I have years. Yes, Elias agreed. You do. They remained until full darkness arrived, standing beside the carved beam that marked new beginnings. Around them, Dunbar Hollow settled into night. A community wounded but alive, afraid but hopeful, scarred but fundamentally unbroken. Elias touched the carved letters one final time before turning toward home. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.